Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, May 10th, 2023. And if you're anything like me, you've heard plenty of supporters of the monster state, people in power and their tools, telling us about how the debt limit, the national debt, must be increased, or we're going to have absolute chaos. But the truth is, it's actually the other way around. And things are only going to get worse unless people take a different approach. And I want to start out with this, covering or just mentioning here the biggest big government guy of the time of the founding generation, Alexander Hamilton, here in a letter to Robert Morris in April 1781. And he wrote that a national debt, if not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be powerful cement of our union. It will also create check this out. It will create a necessity for keeping up taxation to a degree which, without being oppressive, will be a spur to industry. So Hamilton loved debt as a tool to raise taxes, in essence, to do what they do today, as a tool of control. But even he thought, if Hamilton thought that you couldn't have too much debt, you couldn't have too much taxation, and you compare it with what they have today, there's an unlimited amount of both that they'd love to eat up and just kind of eat out our substance. Well, anyways, on the other hand, James Madison, here he is in Political Observations in April of 1795. He felt that debt was part of a trifecta of tyranny, of despotism. He wrote that armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. Madison, of course, was a student of history, so were most people at that time in comparison to today. And he recognized that all through history, they used these three tools as a way to dominate the many. Here's Thomas Jefferson talking about the difference between the Hamiltonian view and the people who more like liberty or decentralization, federalism, the Constitution, etc. Here he is in a letter to George Washington, September of 1792. And he said, "This exactly marks the difference between Colonel Hamilton's views and mine, that I wish the debt paid tomorrow. He wishes it never to be paid, but always to be a thing wherewith to corrupt and manage the legislature." So Hamilton wanted to keep an ongoing debt. And if you recognize the maxim of human nature, that when people with power will always try to expand their power, government always grows. St. George Tucker said all governments have a tendency towards an increase. They always tend to grow. And as long as you give them this kind of tool, why would you be surprised if it gets to the point where it spirals out of control and they have way too much? It's excessive beyond what Hamilton ever recognized. And Jefferson saw this problem. He wanted to get rid of the debt immediately. He thought if you had a debt, pay it off, and then you have really good credit, and when you need it, you borrow some more, and then you pay it off. And that's what he's telling George Washington. And Washington took this view in his fifth annual message to Congress, December of 1793. He said, "No pecuniary consideration is more urgent than the regular redemption and discharge of the public debt. On none can delay be more injurious or an economy of time more valuable." He's basically taking the position, this is the Washingtonian way of putting Jefferson's views out there to Congress. I wish the debt be paid tomorrow. And that's what Washington is telling Congress. Hey, we've got to have a regular redemption and discharge of the public debt. Let's pay it down, get rid of it. I mean, he still worked with Hamilton, so that's maybe a different discussion. Here's Jefferson again in a letter to William Plumer, July of 1816. He said, "I place economy among the first and most important of virtues, and public debt as the greatest of the dangers to be feared." So they all were familiar with this whole idea, this Hamiltonian view that got out there that a public debt was a blessing and that somehow you could keep government in check and just give it tools to keep growing, but somehow it's not going to because you'll just have good people in power that won't screw everybody over. And so he thought this was danger. To have an ongoing debt was one of the greatest dangers, or the greatest of the dangers, to be feared. And James Madison took the same type of a view. He said, "I go on the principle," and this is a letter to Henry Lee in 1790, "I go on the principle that a public debt is a public curse. And in a representative government, maybe Republican, I'm not sure what he means there. It's you can see here on the screen if you're watching, it's rep government. greater than in any other. So a public curse in a popular or federal type of a system, Republican form of government, greater than any other curse out there is having an ongoing public debt. Here's how Thomas Jefferson put it to Samuel Kercheval in 1816. He said, "We must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt." We posted this over on Twitter and on our other socials just the other day, and someone had a great response. He said, maybe we should not have let ourselves have rulers either. And I guess that's part of the problem as well, and it's a really good piece of feedback. But Jefferson recognized that as long as you have ongoing debt, no matter what, they're going to use it as a tool of oppression. Madison recognized that this was a tool of oppression, but they were far from alone. Here's John Adams even, another big government guy on the Federalist side, in his first annual message to Congress, November of 1797. He said the consequences, and he recognized what was going on in Europe, at least in more modern times at that point, the consequences arising from the continual accumulation of public debts in other countries ought to admonish us to be careful to prevent their growth in our own. Now, he recognized just what everybody else was going to say. Well, if you don't have this debt, how are you going to what about security? What about national defense? And they're always going to use fear of foreign dangers. Madison, of course, in the following year in 1798, May, just months after this message to Congress from Adams, because the Adams administration was using fear of foreign danger to restrict liberty at home, Madison, in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, recognized, he said, perhaps it's a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. So we'll hear every time you want to cut back spending. And most of the time today, when they talk about cutting spending, they're not actually cutting spending. What they're talking about is cutting the increase. So if they had a planned increase of spending on a particular budget, maybe the national defense budget, the planned increase is 5%. And they want to cut that back to a 3%, it's still an increase. But then you're going to have all kinds of people saying, this person who wants to cut back on this is the most dangerous person on earth. And we are all going to die, dogs and cats living together, etc. And then on the other side of the political spectrum, if you want to cut back on the potential increase of a social program, they're saying, oh, you're heartless and you want to kill people. You want people dying in the streets. You don't want anyone to have a social safety net, etc. As soon as you give people these programs where people live in fear that if they don't have them, they're going to die or someone's going to come and destroy the entire country, this is a very powerful tool. Anyway, so Adams also recognized that national defense was an issue here. This was going to be a conversation piece if you talked about spending less or having less debt. He said the national defense must be provided for as well as the support of government, but both should be accomplished as much as possible by immediate taxes and as little as possible by loans. In other words, stop spending more than they take in. And that's seriously a problem today on the government level and for many individuals as well. There is a lot of debt out there. We live on a mountain of debt, and things that can't go on forever don't. I will link to this and all these other sources, these quotes, these original documents, letters, etc. in the show notes. I publish a blog post usually a couple of hours after the live stream is done. I've got some things that I got to do away from home here today, so I probably won't publish the blog for this until much later today. But that's going to be over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. In case you're saying, hey, I want to see that Hamilton thing in full, it will be linked there, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. You'll also find all the different platforms we're on. We, of course, live stream on the mainstream video platforms like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Twitch and LinkedIn. We also live stream over at rumble.com and odyssey.com. I appreciate you guys following us on these so-called alternative platforms because we want to be as many places as possible in case, one day you wake up and you're like thinking Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. That's funny. 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. And where are you guys? Well, we might get booted from one of these platforms one of these days. Who knows? But then you'll be able to find us, all the other ones that we're on, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while I'm doing that quick advertorial thing there. I appreciate you guys being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. There's Sparrow Dynamics who says, good morning to those who value liberty. Good to see you, Haji in Southeast Michigan, Joseph Bonamolo in NorCal, King Nobody in Central Colorado, Jacob, Dave Simmons, Douglas, Adam, that Liberty Gal, Peter D, Cowboy Roy Rogers, And royalty DLC. That's pretty cool. Love the dogs and cats quotes. I mean, that's pretty legendary. I appreciate that you recognize that one. Anyways, let me get back to this. And again, 10thAmendmentCenter.com/path to liberty is where you're going to find links to these original source documents so you can read them in context and learn more on your own time. So George Washington repeatedly warned about the debt. Here he is in his famous farewell address, which was originally drafted by James Madison in 1792 under Washington's direction. Here's the stuff that we want to cover. You put it together. And he wanted to be out after one term. But Jefferson and others convinced him to stay to kind of cement the Union, I guess. Hamilton did some revisions on this follow-up for 1796, but this is how it came out. He said, as a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. There's a lot to unpack in this whole speech, and I'm not going to get into it in details. I've covered Washington's farewell in its own episode at least once, if not 2 or 3 times. But he specifically is relating the idea of the public debt, public credit, the national debt, whatever we want to call it, the debt ceiling, with strength and security. If you don't treat it cautiously and you're not frugal about it, you're actually making the entire country weaker, because when you're in debt to someone or to another country, they hold you over the barrel in the long run. As a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. One method of preserving it is to use it as sparingly as possible. And that's nowhere close to where we are today. I mean, you could love Washington, you can hate him, you can think he's one of the good guys, bad guys, who knows, maybe flip-flop, doesn't matter. These points are being totally ignored today. It's not even close. When they're saying if they don't keep spending, they don't keep raising the debt ceiling, they don't keep ripping off us and the world, really, and then printing money to devalue what they pay on that debt. So someone who holds a debt, let's say you owe someone $100, and then you devalue, let's say someone owes you $100, we'll put it that way. And then that person devalues the currency, and by the time they pay you, that $100 only has $20 in purchasing power. That's another way that the U.S. so-called federal government is ripping off people all around the globe, and they continue to do this. But they've got a scenario where people are still willing to accept these kind of funny money, fake fiat dollars. But anyways, using public credit as sparingly as possible is one of the ways to cherish it, and that's one of the ways to ensure strength and security of a country. He said, avoid occasions of expense by cultivating peace, but remembering also that timely disbursements to prepare for danger frequently prevent much greater disbursements to repel it. So in other words, if you need to take on debt, pay it down quickly. People will see you as very responsible and give you more credit when you need it. And that's the same in kind of a day-to-day life. If you run a business, for example, now, of course, government is not a business. They treat it like that. It's a business of screwing people over. But again, George Washington, cherish public credit. He said, avoid likewise the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertion in time of peace, to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned, not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. I mean, just think of how evil it is to take on an almost unpayable debt and foist that upon generations that you may never know. Not saying that you're doing this, but that, I think, is incredibly evil. Putting people under the yoke of a massive, crushing debt. Let's just kick the can down the line. Let's just print more money. Let's just devalue the currency and make everything worse and keep borrowing and spending. Someone else will take care of it. And to me, that is one of the worst parts of human nature, the willingness of so many people to let future generations pay for the pain that you today are causing. Again, not you. I don't want to put blame on you personally, and I'm grateful for you being here. But that's George Washington in his farewell address. Of course, I will link to that in the show notes. You should read the whole thing at least once a year or every couple of years over at 10thAmendmentCenter.com/path to liberty. Here's Thomas Jefferson to Destutt de Tracy, December of 1820. He's also recognizing the connection, just like Madison, armies and debts and taxes. War, he said, is one of the greatest threats to the public liberty because war gives you armies, and from armies you get debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. That's me off the top of my head with the paraphrase. Washington is also recognizing in his farewell address that you avoid a huge debt by cultivating peace. So stay out of this kind of warfare mentality that has been pervasive for generations here in the United States. And here's Jefferson in 1820 recognizing the same thing. He said, it is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes. There's a letter that's kind of famous, and if you're researching constitutional history between him and Madison, where he's basically saying, you know, after a certain amount of time, the debt should be considered null and void if people can't pay it off. And then if they take on too much debt, they're going to create problems in different ways. So he wanted to see debt always paid off within a generation at most. And that's what he's saying here a couple decades later. He had this same mentality all along. If you take on debt, do it when you need it. Don't take on too much. Pay it down immediately. That's what he and Albert Gallatin worked to do while he was in office, and Gallatin was his Secretary of the Treasury, and they were pretty successful at that. They didn't pay it totally down, but they certainly got it reduced significantly. Pay down its debts as it goes. A principle which, I'll read the whole thing again so it's in context without me blabbing. It is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes. A principle which, if acted on, would save one half the wars of the world. Think of how many wars were fought over, well, Jefferson put it much better than I do. Here's Brutus in his 8th Anti-Federalist paper in 1788. And he was warning about the power to borrow money. He saw it as being unlimited. And everyone would say, oh, no, it's not supposed to be like that. And Brutus, like other anti-federalists, Cato, Sentinel, Federal Farmer, and others, sometimes mentioned, oh, I recognize that what legally the Constitution says is this, but we recognize also human nature, and over time they're going to twist, they're going to use these definitions and ways to expand their own power. When Benjamin Franklin kind of shopped around his first draft for the Articles of Confederation in July, I think, of 1775, I forget the exact date, but it was in 1775, and Thomas Jefferson got his hands on it, and he really liked it, but he wrote in some handwritten note in it, in the sidebar, he basically said, what's this term general welfare? We shouldn't use terms that can be indefinite, undefinable, even if you recognize what it is in law, because over time, people with power will use anything that can expand their power in ways, whether the people are going to be smart about it or not, they're always going to try to twist it. And that's what Brutus, I think, is getting at here in his 8th paper as well. He's recognizing that, okay, maybe you say there's limits, but the way I'm reading it, if I read it like this, someone in power in the future is going to read it like this as well. He's not saying this, but that's the overall message that I get a lot of times when reading the Anti-Federalist papers. He said, the power to borrow money is general and unlimited. Under this authority, the Congress may mortgage any or all the revenues of the Union as a fund to loan money upon. And it is probably in this way they may borrow of foreign nations a principal sum, the interest of which will be equal to the annual revenues of the country. And I'm not sure if the annual revenues today, I think maybe it's in the trillions, multi-trillions revenues. Annual theft of the country is somewhere around maybe 4 trillion. My numbers are probably way off, and maybe the interest is like under $1 trillion. So it's getting there, just the interest. But they can't pay the interest and pay down the debt and keep all these programs, keep the largest government in the history of the world as is and growing. It's not possible. Brutus goes on, he says, by this means, they may create a national debt so large as to exceed the ability of the country ever to sink. And what was his concern? Well, he said, I can scarcely contemplate a greater calamity that could befall this country than to be loaded with a debt exceeding their ability ever to discharge. And that's kind of where we are today. I mean, if we're not right on that right now, it's so close, because what they're telling us is, well, the debt that we have can't be paid with the revenues that we have. And when I'm talking about debt, I'm talking about the obligation, and we're not even talking about all the unfunded things. I mean, it's probably way closer to 120, 130 trillion rather than 30. There's all kinds of other stuff that they don't count in that. So what they claim that they're obligated to pay, whether it's to people, to the states, to foreign countries, to people holding bonds, etc., like that, it's to the point where even if they could pay it off, It's so close to what Brutus is warning about, this great calamity, that they have so much debt that they could never pay. He was very, very concerned about that. And Patrick Henry was as well. He warned about this in the Virginia Ratifying Convention in June of 1788. He said, you never will pay your debts, but by a radical change of domestic economy. In other words, you can't deal with the debt unless you cut down spending. And that's something that no one seems willing to do. At best, rather than eliminating stuff, we hear about this cut in the rate of increase, and that's just not gonna, it's not gonna cut it. You never will pay your debts, said Patrick Henry, but by a radical change of domestic economy. At present, you buy too much and make too little to pay. Not much different than what we have today, but Lysander Spooner, I think, summed it up best. I covered this in an episode just on Monday. This is at the end of his No Treason number 6 in 1870. The Constitution of No Authority is the title of this one. He said, the lesson taught by all these facts is this: as long as mankind continue to pay national debts, and I love that he put that in quotes, national debts so-called, that is, so long as they are such dupes and cowards as to pay for being cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, so long there will be enough to lend the money for those purposes. And with that money, a plenty of tools called soldiers can be hired to keep them in subjugation. And maybe arming up 80, 90,000 IRS agents aren't technically soldiers, but we really do have a de facto standing army, permanent standing army domestically, as well as the largest standing army around the globe in history. So this is a very dangerous combination, especially when you're looking at what James Madison warned about. Armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. And even though they let us feel like we're free in some situations, they can pull the plug on so many things whenever they want. In a state of fear, you'll find millions of people begging for government to protect. The government that has been ripping people off for generations is supposedly the same organization that's going to protect us from all kinds of dangers, foreign and domestic. But Spooner really had a way with words, didn't he? As long as people are willing to continue paying for this, and they are willing to pay for being cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, they're going to keep finding people who are willing to do that. And he sums it up with this: but when they refuse any longer to pay for being thus cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, they will cease to have cheats and usurpers and robbers and murderers and blood money loan mongers for masters. And I think that kind of gets back to the quote that we got in response to the Jefferson, don't let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. And Spooner maybe takes it to the next level. Just don't give them the money. And as long as people give them the money, you're going to have people who are acting like rulers and masters. And when the people decide enough is enough, that's when it stops. Let me take a look over in the live chat and see if there's any comments or questions I can get to. I do want to also mention that if you think that this is the kind of message that you want more and more people to hear about, we work to do that every single day. And nothing helps us get that job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, throw it our way. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. And no one out there does more with less to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, teach people how to defend both when government refuses to do so, which is constantly done here at the TAC, at least in my view. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Let me take a look and see if there's any comments here. Joseph says, y'all rock. I appreciate you. Appreciate you being here as well. Liberty Spike says, I honestly believe the goal is to crash the economy and make the way for a new global currency. How can their goal be otherwise? I'm not sure I don't know what the motivation is, but sociopaths always are sociopaths. They will lie to you with a straight face. They will rip you off whenever they can, and they will just make total destruction in some situations. But of course, to them, it's for your benefit somehow. So they think maybe some of these people think they're probably doing good things. Maybe some of them are just nasty, evil monsters, and I'm sure there's a little bit of that as well. But the problem with these pathologies is they think they're doing good things. And then, of course, there are so many tools and dupes that follow for this kind of stuff. or there's cowards that refuse to take a stand. And I think we all have a little bit of that cowardice. I know sometimes I do, because we're talking about the largest, most dangerous government in history. This is not an easy thing to turn around. And this isn't the episode for talking about that strategy, but maybe Monday's episode or a few others are good to check out. Here's Haji. He says, Washington, Jefferson et al. Sound like Ron Paul on topics of war, peace, government, debt, etc. And I actually cited Ron Paul's Liberty Defined that was published over at Mises.org on Monday's episode. And he actually pointed out in that, when he was talking about how he defines liberty, he goes back to a pretty Jeffersonian view. He specifically cited that as well. So that's kind of unsurprising, but I appreciate that comment as well. Joseph says, we have debt because we can't borrow against our own worth, which is supposed to be how it works. Our worth has been sold out from under us. That actually goes totally over my head, but I wanted to read that because I thought it was interesting anyways. Royalty says, the Bible says to have a debt jubilee every 7 years. I haven't heard of that either. I'm not sure what a jubilee is. That like to pay it off or to take on more or to disavow it? I'm not sure. Jefferson certainly had the view that every generation should get rid of its debt, pay it off completely. He and Gallatin worked in that direction. They did not complete the job, and, well, certainly it started growing once again, and it gets worse and worse and worse, because eventually there's going to be some kind of emergency comes up, some kind of foreign policy issue, and then they're going to take on more debt, and that's the whole point. Because if you're loaded with debt, this is a national security problem as well. Eventually, you are indebted to, I don't know, some other country who holds a lot of your bonds, and if they dump them, they're going to destroy your currency. You're giving people the ability to manipulate and control your national security. That is not a good choice. So when people tell us, oh, this country or that country is incredibly dangerous, I think the one that's the most dangerous to us is the government that sits in Washington, D.C., because they're creating a threat situation for us at almost every turn. Anyways, I'll look a little bit more at the chat later on today when I do the blog post, maybe later this afternoon, 3, 4, 5 p.m. Pacific time here. I will publish that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Please do continue leaving comments, whether it's live or in the archive. Smash the like button, reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. All that stuff can help trigger these algorithms of these mainstream platforms and tells them to show us to more people. And I really appreciate the help in spreading the word. And of course, there's that membership program. Don't feel obligated to join us. But if you do have a couple of bucks of that government fiat, throw it our way, and we will use it against them to the best of our ability. Again, I appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you found this interesting. I hope it was educational. That's more important than anything. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.